Hello and welcome to more history stuff. And this is the latest in a series of mini biographies of historical figures from the 13th century. In the last episode I looked at the career of Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, Prince of Wales, and today I want to look at one of his contemporaries, and this is Rhys ap Maredudd, a slightly more obscure figure but just as important in his way. So who was Rhys? Well, he was the head of the House of Dinefwr, and this was one of the most important princely royal dynasties in medieval Wales. There were three of them essentially. There was Gwynedd in the north, Powys in mid Wales, and then the House of Dinefwr in the south. And Rhys's dynasty controlled much of South Wales. But Rhys is not a straightforward figure. He was, as I said, very much a Welsh prince, but he was also a marcher lord. What do I mean by that? Well, his father was Maredudd ap Rhys Grig, the previous head of the House of Dinefwr, but his mother was Isabella Marshall, and she was the granddaughter of the famous William Marshall, who you've probably heard of, who has been described as the greatest knight, and he served 5 kings of England and eventually drove the French out of England and so forth. So Rhys is of mixed bloodline, and this dual identity, if you like, it's one of the motives for his quite sort of ambivalent behaviour throughout his career. Rhys has also inherited a dynastic feud with the Lords of Gwynedd in North Wales, who at this time were led by Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, who my last video was all about. Llywelyn at this time was trying to unite the whole of Wales under his banner, but he encounters a lot of resistance, a lot of pushback from the other powerful princes of Wales, and Rhys is very much one of them. And this is because Rhys's father, Maredudd, had been generally opposed to Llywelyn. At times he fought for him, but in general, especially towards the end of his career, he was very much opposed. And when Llywelyn effectively takes control of the whole of Wales via the Treaty of Montgomery in 1267, Maredudd is the only Welsh ruler who is reluctant to swear fealty to Llywelyn. He's eventually forced to by the English, ironically, but it's not something he wants to do. He doesn't want to acknowledge Llywelyn's supremacy at all, because his dynasty has got its own claim to rule Wales. One of his ancestors, the Lord Rhys, had tried to press his claim to be the rightful ruler of Wales. And Maredudd is not prepared to surrender to Gwynedd, essentially. And when he dies, he passes on this grudge, this old feud, to his son Rhys, his heir and successor. And this explains Rhys's actions when Llywelyn eventually goes to war with King Edward I of England, Longshanks, in 1276. At first, Rhys pretends to fight for Llywelyn, but very quickly, in the early months of the war, he and the other lords of South and West Wales, they all submit very quickly, and they throw in their lot with the king, and they help him to defeat Llywelyn in 1277 and force him to agree to a humiliating peace treaty, the Treaty of Aberconwy, which again I described in my previous video. And Rhys does this because, well, A, as I said, he's very much opposed to Llywelyn and doesn't want to accept his authority. But B, he's hoping that Edward, in gratitude, will restore the ancient kingdom, essentially, of what was called the Hewbarth, or the Haybarth, sorry, my pronunciation isn't great, which was the ancient bounds of the Kingdom of South Wales that Rhys's ancestors once ruled over. And he's basically hoping that Edward will make him essentially the supreme ruler of South and West Wales, and a king in his own right, really. What he fails to appreciate is that Edward is, while he's prepared to give Rhys a certain amount of power, he's not going to let him be that powerful because, well, Edward is not in the business of setting up rivals. He's not going to create an empire in Wales, led by a man who might well, if he gets too powerful, will challenge the king in the future. Um, and what Edward allows Rhys to do is to be the most powerful Welsh lord in the south, and he's given control of one of his ancestral castles, which is Drysloin, at one end of the Towey Valley in South Wales. But the other castle of Dinefwr, which is really the heartland of Rhys's territory and his main ancestral seat or fortress, Edward takes that under royal control. He puts an English garrison in there, and he won't compromise on that. He's not letting Rhys have Dinefwr back, because Dinefwr is probably the most important castle in South Wales, and whoever controls it basically controls that territory, which is what Edward wants. He wants control. Now, Rhys can have his other castles, and he can have his other lands, and he can push around his neighbours and generally behave like a little emperor if he likes. But he's not going to achieve everything that he wants. He's not going to get everything that he wants from Edward. And in the following years after the war, there's further tensions as Rhys is jostled about by Edward's administrators. He doesn't get on with his English neighbours. They're at loggerheads all the time. He's summoned to attend the English court, which he regards as an offence to his dignity as a prince. Edward does give him a few more sweeteners. For instance, he allows Rhys to have a market, a monthly market on his lands, and to take profits from that. But in general, Rhys isn't getting everything that he wanted from this deal. But even so, despite all these problems, when the next war breaks out in 1282, he remains loyal to the king. Because whatever his problems with the English and Edward I, he still regards them as preferable to submitting to Llywelyn, whom Rhys clearly hates more than anyone on the planet. And he, as I said, he continues to fight loyally for Edward. When the Royal Army suffers a defeat in West Wales in the summer of 1282, Rhys actually steps in and he enables the English to rebuild their army by supplying his own men to fill the gaps, to replace the casualties of this defeat. And he is very much committed to the royal cause still, and he benefits because pretty much all of his Welsh neighbours, unlike the previous conflicts, they choose to fight for Llywelyn this time round. As a result, Edward disinherits them all. He confiscates all their land, and he gives it all to Rhys, because needs must. Rhys is now one of the very few loyalist Welshmen in South Wales whom Edward can depend upon. So it makes sense to reward him with the lands of those men who have gone back to Llywelyn. And Rhys probably calculated this. He probably judged this moment, and he does very well out of it. At the end of the war, after Llywelyn and his brother Dafydd are killed, and Edward conquers Wales, essentially, Rhys is left in place, and he's now riding very high indeed. He is now the Lord of the South, basically, which probably is not what Edward originally intended. He didn't want to make Rhys that powerful, but that's what he ended up doing through necessity. But unfortunately, Rhys is still not happy. He's still having a lot of arguments with his neighbours, the other lords of the March, a lot of disputes and conflicts. Edward goes abroad to Gascony in southwest France, and so he's not really there to keep a lid on the situation. And in 1287, quite unexpectedly, Rhys suddenly goes into revolt. He decides enough is enough. He's lost patience, and he raises his men and triggers this potentially very dangerous revolt in South Wales against the king and against English authority. And the regent of England, who's been left to rule the kingdom in Edward's absence, is Edmund, Earl of Cornwall. And Edmund, when he receives news that Rhys has gone into rebellion, he overreacts, really. He seems to panic a little bit. He's probably thinking that this could spiral out of control, because that's what had happened 4 years earlier. Wales had suddenly exploded into revolt from one end of the country to the other, and Edmund is nervous that that could happen again. And he certainly doesn't want that to happen on his watch, because he knows he's got Edward watching his performance, and if the king comes home to find that Wales has slid into complete chaos again, then Edmund is going to suffer the consequences. So the regent raises this enormous army, and it really is enormous. It's probably the largest army seen in the British Isles to this point. It's about 22,000 men, over 2/3 of which are Welsh, must be said. They're raised from the other territories in the March, or North Wales, Powys. And they all converge on Rhys's castle of Dinefwr, which he'd managed to recapture in the meantime. And that was always his main aim, to recapture Dinefwr, the ancestral seat of his dynasty. Unfortunately for him, Rhys had misjudged the scale of his support within Wales. He might well have hoped that the Welsh would rally to him, but he's just not a very popular figure. He's misjudged his popularity, and this might be because he'd always supported the king against other Welsh princes, and the Welsh in general are just not terribly impressed with his sort of turncoat behaviour, if you like. He is forced to abandon Dinefwr and go to his other castle of Rhys, where the royal armies finally converge and surround him, basically. And it is, as I said, an enormous army. Rhys cannot risk a battle. He can't meet the English in the open, or rather the Anglo-Welsh, if you like, because he's probably only got a couple of thousand men, and this enormous host of over 20,000 men would just crush him if he risks a battle. So he holds up inside Rhys, presumably hoping for a miracle. The siege is pretty tough. It goes on for several weeks. The royal army bombards the castle. There's a lot of fighting. But in the end, I mean, it's hopeless. Rhys is caught like a rat in a trap. He's not going to win. So in the end, he and his wife and children, they're smuggled out of the castle, and he goes on the run. There's a rumour that he managed to get over to Ireland with the help of the March Lords, which might well be the case. And as I said in the early part of this video, Rhys did have a lot of Marcher connections. Not only was his mother a marshal, but his wife was Ada Hastings, who was a member of the powerful Hastings family of Abergavenny. So he's got very close connections to very powerful Marcher Norman families. And he might well have lent on those connections to try and save himself. I mean, Edward I is just as much at loggerheads with the Lords of the March, arguably, than he is with the Welsh princes. So it may well be the case that the Marches were happy to do Rhys a favour, because he was very much part of the club. He was part of the family network. But regardless, he's on the run for several years, and he dips out of sight, only to emerge again in about 1291, when he's found inside the woods near his old territory in South Wales. What he's trying to achieve, or how many followers he has by this point, we don't really know. He's very much an outlaw on the run, and he's eventually tracked down by some local Welshmen who don't like him. As I said, Rhys wasn't terribly popular with the Welsh in general, and they're quite happy to capture him, load him down of chains, and then send him on to the king. Edward is at York in this time, far to the north, and Rhys is presented to him, and there's a very brief trial, and Rhys is hanged like a common criminal on the common gallows at York. We don't know where he's buried. His body is probably thrown into a ditch. His son, Rhys Jr., is taken into English custody, and all we know about him is that he's still a prisoner at Norwich Castle about 30 years later, and then he disappears, probably died in prison. And that's the end of the House of Dinefwr, the end of Rhys ap Maredudd. It's a very sad tale, really. Unfortunately, this era of Welsh history is generally a pretty bleak one. But Rhys makes for a very interesting character study. He's an example of the divided allegiances and loyalties of this era, which are anything but straightforward. if anybody does try to tell you that this era of Welsh history in particular is somehow straightforward, then well, just ask them to read a few like, proper studies of the subject, and it's blindingly obvious that that is anything but. So I hope that was interesting. Once again, I've managed to pack a very complicated subject into about 15 minutes, which is inadequate, but it's only meant to give you a flavour of the subject. So I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you very much. Goodbye.